I used quite a few variable ND filters over the years, and I can already tell you that every single filter out there has a flaw or at least a downside. Some of them might be important for you, others don't, and that's why I'm making this video today. Here we are having the Haida Pro II filter, it's a CPL VND. We have the Freewell variable ND filter V2, the NiSi Swift system, and also Peter McKinnon's new filter, the Chroma from PolarPro. So I want to compare these filters today, tell you about all the downsides, but of course also what's good about those filters, and see at the end of this video which filter you should choose, because as it is so often, some of those downsides don't really matter for you, so in that case you would choose one filter over the other. So let's get started. Before we get started talking about the filter, in case you're starting out as a videographer right now and you're not really sure what ND filters do, or variable ND filters as well, let me explain that quickly for you. Also the other effects that come with those filters is that first, ND filters by itself just make the image darker. What is important, because if you want to get motion blur and background blur at the same time, your image is oftentimes too bright, because that requires an open aperture. The aperture number must be low, 1.4, 2.8 something at least you want to have, usually depending a bit on your focal length as well. And you want to keep the shutter speed twice the frame rates are also pretty low, and that both together usually means that your shot is overexposed, especially when you're shooting outside throughout the day, and that's where ND filters come in. Usually normal ND filters, they just make your image darker by a certain amount and you can't change that, and variable ND filters are essentially two polarizing filters stacked on top of each other that act against it, and when you rotate them they essentially make the image darker, so you have control over how dark it gets. But it also has some problems always, or oftentimes, like color shifts, vignetting, X patterns and all of that stuff, which is why ND filters are actually a bit complicated to make. And then all of those filters, or at least some of them, also come with another feature, which is mist effect. That means that your highlights glow a bit more, which can be nice or not depending on how you see it. Some people like it, some not, so it's really up to you. But then there's also another effect, which is, I mentioned that already, polarization, and that it essentially cuts out reflections. That's, for example, good when you shoot water, then you can look inside the water, or maybe even when you want to film a person through a window, for example, for a certain shot, then you can also take out reflections of the window. Or when I shoot product b-roll here on my table, then I also use polarizing filters to cut out the reflection on the table from the light, because otherwise the colors don't really pop. So these are scenarios where you would use a polarizing filter. And because variable ND filters are essentially two polarizing filters that act against each other, every variable ND filter actually has a polarizing effect as well. So if you screw off any variable ND filter and you turn it around, you can actually see that the polarization changes. I actually use it quite often as well when I use the NiSi system here. We'll come later to that. But some of those filters also give you control over the polarization directly, so you don't have to unscrew the filter. Then it's also important to mention that choosing your variable ND filter depends a bit on certain factors. That is, at first, your camera, like especially if you shoot in log profiles, you oftentimes have to shoot at a bit higher ISOs. And there, of course, the higher the base ISO of your camera is, the more ND you need, the darker you need to make the image. And the same counts for your lens. If the aperture is low, then you also need a higher ND, as with a higher aperture or higher f-stop number. It's actually a wider aperture in that case. And it also depends a bit on the focal length, because if you shoot on ultra wide angle lenses, then it can be that you get vignetting with certain filters. We'll also see that later in the comparison in this video, but that's also to be aware about. But generally, if you shoot at 24mm plus or even 20mm plus, you don't really have to worry about that. But let's now get into the filters to see what filter you should finally get for your system. Yeah. Okay, I will first talk about my experience with each filter and tell you the hard facts about it, so you already know all the advantages and disadvantages of each filter. And later I will also do a comparison of all filters in terms of color shift and also vignetting and cross polarization, so you also know a bit more about the actual performance. But I can already say that they're all not too far away from each other. So let's start with the Haida Pro II here, and this is a 3 to 7 stop filter, which I think is actually a pretty good range for most people, especially if you use f2.8 lenses a lot, because with a normal ISO range that's usually somewhere between 500 and 1150, this 3 to 7 stop filters together with 2.8 lenses is usually the range that you need when you're shooting outside. Of course, there are other scenarios, maybe it's a bit darker when you shoot inside or so, but then you can always take your filter off. And aside from that, what I like about the Haida filter is how they implemented the CPL adjustment. It's just that it has this little knob here, which is there to control the ND of the filter. Maybe you can see that. Now it gets a bit darker and now it gets brighter. And then to change the polarization, you rotate the filter itself. I think from all of those filters, this is the best implementation of that, because both are very easy to control actually. Also good about this filter is the price. If you use it for smaller lenses, you pay $78 only. And if you're in the longer end, 82mm, etc., it goes up to $109. So it's definitely the cheapest one of those filters. But there's one little downside, and that is that you can't get this filter together with a mist effect. It's not a big downside though, because you can always buy a mist filter, screw that onto your lens first and then stack this filter on top. It's just a problem occasionally if you shoot at 16mm or so on ultra wide angle lenses that you might get vignetting then, but it depends a little bit on the special filters that you use there. Aside from that, one thing that I also forgot on the Haida filter is lens caps. Like the Haida filter, as far as I remember, doesn't come with a cap, so that's definitely a downer. I always use my cap here on top of the filter, so see that here. And this is the Freewell V2, which is also a 3 to 7 stop filter. So again, very suitable for most people in my opinion, especially again if you shoot f2.8 lenses. And this filter has the advantage that it comes with a glow mist filter here, so you can just stack that on top magnetically. Really like that design because the magnetism keeps the filter a bit slimmer, and that's good, especially if you shoot at more wide angle lenses. But it also comes with two downsides. The first one is that in order to change the polarization, you have to screw both of those little knobs here off, and I don't think that's a good implementation. Like when you screw it off, you can rotate the whole filter. Otherwise, if you rotate the filter itself, it's that you change the exposure with that. So overall, it's not as good in my opinion as the Haida filter, how they implemented the CPL effect, but it is better as the Peter McKinnon, what we will come to later. And the other disadvantage is that it only comes in a size of 82mm. So if you have smaller lenses, you essentially make the lens bigger, because then you have the tiny lens behind it and you have this big filter in front. Might not be an issue for many people, but I personally don't like it because I prefer my filters being flush with the lens, or at least as flush as possible. No filter is perfectly flush, but you can always use step-up rings in order to use it with smaller lenses, so you can use it. It's just not really as convenient as with some other filters to really match it to your lens. And then with Freewell, it's like they come with a pretty nice cap in the front, but you can't use this cap together with the glow mist filter attached. You have to unattach it and then attach the filter. Otherwise, like, the magnetism works a bit, but you can move that cap around. So that's not really a nice solution in my opinion. And also for the back, like, there comes a plate for it. I think that's for the glow filter or so, but you see, you can't really protect the back with that as well. And talking about price, you can get it in multiple packages. There's one without the mist filter, I think that's around $150, and the whole package where everything is included, including the mist filter, and also I think one for anamorphic lens flares is $230. So it's not super expensive, but also not as cheap as the Haida filter. I think it's overall a pretty good pricing for what you get there. Next one is the Swift system from NiSi, which got pretty popular, I have the impression, recently. This system has the advantage that you get all the stops from 1 to 9 in this system, so everything that you might ever need is covered just with one purchase. And it does that by stacking all those filters. So when I unstack them, you at first have this 1 to 5 stop filter here. You can only use that if you want to. And then you stack a 4 stop filter on top, what essentially makes the 1 to 5 stop filter a 5 to 9 stops. So you have all the stops that are available, but you would have to change filters. This is why I actually think that for vlogging, especially those 3 to 7 stop filters, at least if you're on not too fast lenses, is a bit better because they are usually the 3 to 7 range is enough. While here, if you're somewhere in the middle, let's say you want to change from 5 to 6 or to 7, you would already have to change your filter. So it's a bit more convenient than on the other filter, but therefore the system gives you all of that. Then you can also stack the mist filter on top. And this design is overall good to get all the functionalities, but it also has the big downside that you actually get a lot of vignetting with this filter, which you will also see in the comparison tests soon. Another downside is also that it does not have a native CPL or polarizing functionality. So this is actually a filter that you would always have to unscrew a little bit and then rotate it to change the polarization. It's definitely not suitable for on-the-go shooting because your filter might fall down, but here in my YouTube studio I actually use that quite often to get the reflections off from my table. And aside from that, I have two of those filters. This is the 82 version and I have another one at 67, and on the 67 version I had it once that the filter always fell down because it got loose here. It wasn't as snug as this one here. It wasn't a big issue because I just put some tape around it to make it a bit thicker, and now it holds again, and still it like gets off about the same as this filter now. So it's not a big issue, you can easily fix it, but it is one problem that comes with this system because it's not magnetic or so, you have to stack those filters. And regarding the price, it depends on the features you want to get with the system and also the size. I noted $329 to $479 on B&H, I think it was, for the whole system, like including the mist filter. I think you can get a little bit lower if you only get a 1 to 5 stop version and no mist filter and stuff, but that's oftentimes not enough. So I think if you would want to get this system, then better get the whole system directly so that you have all the functionalities available. And yeah, let's come to the next filter. This is the new Chroma from PolarPro and Peter McKinnon. And this filter, it gives me headaches because on one side it's a really nice filter. Like you see directly how slim that is, so it's really good to avoid vignetting, and it's also super flush with my lens. It doesn't really look bad on any lens, it doesn't increase the diameter and stuff. So overall I like the filter, and that's also the reason why I got it. But there is this big issue that made me angry the day I got the filter, because PolarPro or Peter McKinnon did not mention that in their videos about this filter, not even the tutorial. And that is that in order to change the not the polarization effect, but the ND effect, the exposure, you actually need two hands, or you need to have a bit of luck that it works sometimes with one hand. That is because you have to hold the black part of this filter with one hand and then rotate it with the others to actually change the exposure. Like when I'm out there vlogging, let's say I'm starting vlogging outside and I'm going into a house, then I quickly want to change the exposure with that filter by just grabbing it and turning it around. And I can't do that with this filter because I need two hands. Now, this is the normal version that you just screw onto your lens. There's also the Mag-Lock version. And I saw in some videos that looked a bit like the filters looked a bit different there. And so I'm not sure if that's the Mag-Lock version or what's going on there. So maybe on the Mag-Lock version it's different. But yeah, this version of the filter is, in my opinion, at least for many content creators, if you want to vlog on the go or so, then it's really not good because you always have to use both hands. Of course, if you want to change the polarization of this filter, then this is good because you can only just rotate the filter with one hand and then you change your polarization, but I have to change my exposure a lot more often than I would change my polarization, and that's why this is kind of a design flaw of this filter. I think PolarPro should have at least mentioned that in the tutorial that they did, because I did not think about that at all, especially considering that Peter also vlogs occasionally, so I think he knows about this issue. And there's also another issue with those filters, and that is the price, in my opinion. I mean, they are quality filters overall, so I understand that you want to charge a bit more for producing quality, but one of those filters costs somewhere between $150 and $300 depending which size and version, like Mag-Lock or normal threaded version you get. And each filter either comes at 1 to 5 or 6 to 9 stops, and either with mist or without mist. So if you want to get all those functionality like you would get with the NiSi system, you would essentially have to purchase 4 filters, and that means you would have to spend somewhere between $600 and up to $1,200 for those. I just think that is too much. Like, people buy lenses for that. You can actually get pretty good lenses for that price, even some G Master primes and stuff. So I'm really having a hard time recommending this filter. Well, overall, if you have that money, maybe if you're like me, you only need one filter because, well, my camera shoots ISO 2000, the A9, and yeah, I use fast lenses all the time, then yeah, it's okay, because then you only pay, like in my case, $250 plus taxes once. It's still a lot of money, but then considering that it has this downside that you can't really change the ND quickly, it really makes me question if I should recommend this filter or not. Anyway, pricing is a question that you would have to answer yourself. I would say let's now finally see how those filters stack up against each other when it comes to the quality. Starting with the color shift, the Freewell slightly shifts towards blue and then loses saturation at about 7 stops. The Haida filter is impressive as it only loses saturation, but the colors actually stay super consistent. I was pretty surprised when I saw that. Leads slightly towards blue if we look at the whites, but it's pretty minor, so that's neglectable in my opinion. And then the NiSi filter shifts slightly towards yellow at 1 stop, but it's definitely not bad. It loses a bit of saturation at 5 stop, gains a bit of saturation if the second ND is added because you're switching back to 1 stops. And then if we adjust the filter back, you'd lose a saturation again, but of course it comes from the 1 to 5 stop already. And it has pretty mild color shifts during those adjustments, but it's okay. The white overall stays pretty consistent with this filter. And talking about the PolarPro filter, that behaves very similar to the Haida filter actually. Loses a bit of saturation with consistent colors, but whites lean a bit more towards yellow on the PolarPro. I must definitely say that the Haida and PolarPro filter, they surprised me a lot because their color shifts are really minor, and it's more actually the saturation that shifts there occasionally. And what I also see there is that where it changes often with all of those filters, it's oftentimes just specific colors that are probably affected by the polarization effect. This is just something that manufacturers can't really do anything about it. Also worth mentioning here is that while I clearly think that the Haida and PolarPro filters perform the best here when it comes to color shift, the NiSi and the Freewell, they are not bad at all. They are also very, very good. They are just slightly behind those other 2 filters. And comparing that to like early stage variable ND filters, as we have seen a few years ago, they are all a lot better, because there you always had like strong visible color shifts in your image towards sometimes yellow, sometimes towards magenta. So I think like I would not base my opinion on getting any of those filter on the color shifts, because they are all good enough that you don't really have to worry about that. And talking about vignetting, I tested that in photo mode at an aspect ratio of 3:2, so you should take that with a grain of salt for video, because if you shoot video, you're usually shooting at 16:9 or DCI, or maybe even lower, maybe you even cut something more off in post, and that means that you won't see the vignette, or at least a big part of it anymore, when you're actually shooting videos. What's also worth considering is that some of the vignette I had the impression like comes from the polarization, and that's when you see a bit of vignette on the sides, and you can oftentimes turn the polarization so that it appears up on the top and bottom parts, and then you will also cut them out. Also worth mentioning here is that I was not able to test the Haida filter at 16mm. I was only able to test it at 20mm because I got the 67mm version here only, and I just don't have a lens that is wider than that. Like the widest lens I have is a 13mm APS-C lens, so that's what I tested it with. It's around 20mm on full frame, but the other 3 filters I tested all at 16mm to make it very hard for them to hide their vignetting. Anyway, if we look at the results, surprisingly the Haida filter seemed to have the most vignetting there despite 20mm. That really surprised me, but well, maybe it's a bit from the lens or something like that, I don't know. But yeah, that's what I got there. The NiSi filter has a bit more. Obviously, if you stack all filters on top, then it becomes unusable in 16mm. It's actually, if you only stack 2 filters, that you already see how bad it gets, and at 3 it's pretty much unusable. That's why I would only recommend the NiSi filter if you shoot 18mm plus, probably even 19 or 20mm. Because yeah, the vignetting is actually quite strong there if you stack all those filters. And Freewell and PolarPro are overall quite similar. The vignetting is pretty low. I mean, on the PolarPro, it's definitely also because the filter is a little bit wider than the lens. Not too wide though, it still looks good and feels good. But, well, that's definitely how they do it here. Well, I think on the PolarPro filter, it's just because it is so slim, it is so close to the lens that you don't see much vignetting as well. It's actually very good design in that case for the PolarPro filter. What you probably also noticed in those tests was the cross polarization, always when it got to the upper stop number. There, I must say that none of those filters actually perform great. They all look relatively similar. Of course, the Haida looks a little bit better there because it's more zoomed in, and that's also something worth mentioning here. This is all 16 millimeters where the cross polarization becomes a bit more prominent, but the moment you zoom a bit more in, then the sides leave it out and you essentially also end up with a better image. So let's finally come to my recommendations. I overall think that if you don't need that mist effect, you should definitely look into the Haida filter here because it is just the most affordable one and it's overall pretty good. Has a bit more vignetting, at least from my test here, but that's okay. I actually like to have a bit of vignette added in post anyway, so if it's in there already, that's fine. Or what you can also do, if you have a smaller lens, you can just get an 82mm version, or I'm not sure if they have 92mm or so, but just get a bigger version and use a step-up ring because that also gets rid of vignetting. And talking about the Freewell V2 filter, I think overall that it's a great filter as well, especially if you want to have the mist effect included into the system and if you also want to have anamorphic lens flares and stuff, because there are also magnetic stackable filters for that available. And I think the NiSi filter is great if you want to have the full ND range from 1 to 9 stops and you also want to have that mist effect, because there you get it at a relatively affordable price still, at least comparing it to the Peter McKinnon filters. But of course, if you shoot a lot of ultra wide angle stuff, then that might not be the filter for you because of vignetting. But there's also a little trick. If you want to use it, for example, with a 16mm lens and you vlog a lot, then you can turn active stabilization, for example, on Sony cameras. They crop in quite a lot, especially when you use dynamic active, and that gets rid of the vignetting and you have a super stable image then. So it's not that this filter is unusable on ultra wide angle lenses, just depends a little bit on the specific settings. So for some people it might be worth it, for others not. Yeah, that's a tough one. I think those filters are great for professionals like cinematographers and maybe commercial filmmakers or so, like generally people that work in teams, because there you usually have the times to use both hands to adjust your ND, or you have an assistant that can do so while you're taking a shot. So that's not really a problem, and then the money is also there because it's a business expense overall anyway. It might also be interesting for landscape photographers that want something small and again have the time to make all the adjustments. But for the general content creator and vlogger, I think those are not really the right filters, just because of the price and also the fact that it just takes longer to adjust your VND. I would not buy this filter again just because of this issue, and especially at that price. And yeah, that's all about those filters. You will find links to all of them in the description below. Those are affiliate links, so I get a small commission if you purchase through those links, but you don't pay anything extra. So that's a great way to support this channel if you found this video helpful. And aside from that, if you actually found it helpful, please leave me a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and I hope to see you in future videos. Bye!